Good afternoon. I hope this guy can speak well. Nice introduction. I spoke last fall to the incoming freshman class and parents at Fairleigh Dickinson University. And I said to them, you know, I really don't worry much what you students are going to do the day after graduation. We have an incredible placement rate. Over 90% of undergraduates are employed or in graduate school within 30 days. What I really worry about, though, is what you're going to be doing in the year 2021. Blank expressions in the room. Why does the president worry about what the undergraduate class is going to be doing in 2021? Why is that important? Let me tell you why it's important. Because in 2021, the freshman class of this fall will be entering the decade of your 30s. And if you haven't got it together by the decade of your 30s, it's not going to happen. Moreover, the decade of your 30s is when you're just beginning to make your greatest professional contributions to your community, to your organization, to your world, and to your family and community. And oh, by the way, everything before that is rehearsal. So we've got to prepare the freshman class of this year for the decade beginning in 2021. So what's it going to be like? What's the world going to be like in 2021? I like the quote that is not by a baseball player, but by Niels Bohr, the great physicist. Predictions is very difficult, especially about the future. In fact, we human beings, one of my hobbies is to collect predictions about the future that were wrong. It's a very easy hobby to have because there's so many of them. We are horrible at making predictions. For example, in 1897, Lord Kelvin said radio has no future. In 1903, the president of Michigan Savings Bank advised Henry Ford's lawyer not to invest in the Ford Motor Company. It's just a fad. The horse is here to stay. In 1962, would you like to have been the executive that turned down the Beatles, saying that groups of guitars are just on the way out? It gets worse. In 1968, Business Week predicted that the Japanese car industry has no future in America. Helmut Schmidt, in 1988, said that Germany would not be reunited in his lifetime. The wall fell the next year. It's an unpredictable world. We cannot predict what the world's going to be like in 2021 with any degree of confidence or accuracy. But you know, sometimes the sum of events predict a pathway, a direction of things that are happening that we suspect are going to continue into the future, and therefore influence that decade that's so important to the freshman class this year. So I'd like to suggest to you today 5 trends that will define the world of 2021. Number 1. Why? Because it points to opportunities and obstacles. And it should be guiding those of us in higher education to saying, this may be the new skill set. Number 1, it will be an increasingly diverse world. 25% of the world's population moves every year. 2008 in the United States was a bad year. The Census Bureau says only 17% of the U.S. population changed addresses. In the world, it takes 2.4 live births per female to maintain a population. Today, in Germany, France, and Japan, the birth rate is 1.3. They're not replacing themselves. Declining birth rates in developing countries mean that if you want to maintain the standard of living, then you have to have immigration. You and I both know that's not going to happen in Japan. And you and I both know that the face of Europe is changing because of the immigration and the importation of labor. And in fact, much of the social conflict that's going on right now is that the concern that French are going to remain French and Germans aren't going to remain Germans. There's going to be an integration of people from different parts of the world. Well, let me tell you, in 20 years, they're going to be German. They're going to be a different set of Germans, different set of French. The world is becoming more diverse because of the mobility of humanity. It's an increasingly diverse world. Look at the U.S. demographics. Look what's happening in our country. Today, 3 states, the majority language in 3 states of the United States is Spanish. By 2020, it'll be 10 states. By the way, it's California, New Mexico, and Texas, if you wondered. Look at the birth rates in the United States. Look at what's just happening in the region in which you live. Caucasians are flat. African Americans are moderately just above flat. Hispanics are off the chart. This is going to be a different world. It's going to be a more diverse world. Within a 50-mile radius of my university, my campus in New Jersey, 105 different languages are spoken. It's going to be the nature of the world. In 2009, 825,000 million passengers, not 825,319 passengers, but 825 million passengers flew on only the top 10 airlines in the world today. We are moving around the world. And in fact, you're only 14 hours away from anybody else anywhere in the world. In 14 hours, you can be next to somebody you've never known before, somewhere else on the face of the earth. The year 2020, you are going to be living, working, and playing with individuals different from you. It is a pathway that's underway. That means you need to learn to be comfortable in environments of differences and diversity. You need to learn and understand that differences between humanity is not a weakness, it's a strength. Just because somebody is different from you, they're not wrong, they're simply different, and you better look and see how you can work together with those differences to solve some of the problems that are taking place today that we can't solve. Number 2, second trend line that's defining the world of 2020, 2021. An increasing permeability of national borders. Let me tell you, we were raised, many of us in this country, in other parts of the world, believing that the national borders were going to keep us safe. Not the case today. The reality is that national borders and national sovereignty is important, but it's not going to keep you safe. There is no passport control for the major issues facing the survival of this species. Health pandemics, lemon warning, terrorism, economic interaction and impact. None of these things stop at borders. They cross with impunity. I got on a plane in New Delhi one morning, and I was fortunate enough to be in the front of the plane. And I looked up, and a fly flew in the front door just as they closed the door. I flew to JFK. We landed. I unbuckled. I looked up as they opened the door. The fly flew out, flying around the world. Ideas, objects, problems and solutions fly around the world in instances. You remember February 5th, 1997, don't you? Of course. That's the day in Thailand that a large land property company called Samsung defaulted on its investment in Eurobonds, its commitment. That one crisis frightened the Thai stock market. No problem. First part of the month, next month, the finance minister suspended trading in bank and financial shares, saying things will stabilize. The following 5 days saw depositors withdraw an estimated $1.2 billion from local and regional banks and finance companies. Within the next week, their stock market dropped to a 5-year low, and by the middle of the spring, Thailand's largest finance company, Finance One, was bankrupt. This impact started to spread to other nations. Banks cut back on loans, raised interest rates. Companies and financial institutions all across East Asia fell. For example, South Korea's largest car maker at the time, Kia Motors, asked for emergency loans and was eventually taken over by Hyundai. Investors lost confidence and moved their money elsewhere. The stock markets in the Far East crashed, and what started as a local, small financial problem quickly became regional and devastational and global. Within 2 years, Malaysia's economy shrank by 25%, South Korea's by 45%, and Indonesia's by 80%. Because there were so many links, because there were aftershocks that spread around the world. Banks that held Thai baht also held Brazilian reals. So within that 2-year period, it came to the United States, and up until recently, it caused the greatest single drop in the U.S. stock market in recent history. This is an interconnected economic world. You have seen that in the last 2 years. The increasing permeability of national borders is a reality, and it's going to continue. So that means that if you never leave home, events around the world are going to affect your lives. That means that you've got to pay attention to what's happening in the world. Because if you don't pay attention, you're going to be swept over by a maelstrom of change that's unanticipated. It's going to sweep you away. You've got to pay attention. Number 3, further migration of technology to the end user. Whew, what in heaven's name does that mean? I'm a student of technology, the history of technology, and you of course know the first typewriter came out in around 1870. And you of course know who the first author that wrote and delivered a book on a typewriter, who that was, right? That's right in the back of the room, Mark Twain, exactly right. In fact, he put in his will that he said that it was not until after his death could it be announced that he had written the book on this, because he didn't want to be bothered by so many people asking how he liked the typewriter. In 1870, the typewriter was considered to be a highly technical, sophisticated machine that requires special expertise and special training. And in fact, until 1908, it was assumed that women didn't have the mental or physical stamina to run a typewriter. And what happened in 1908? YMCA opened the first class to teach women how to use a typewriter. Future years, it condemned women to jobs that were much beneath them. But that's a reality. And how did this get adopted? How did this technical device get adopted in the corporate community? Well, they created something called steno pools. It still was a talented skill to be able to typewrite. So that executives would dictate. The great shorthand company made a fortune teaching people, women, how to take shorthand. The shorthand would go into the steno pools, they'd type the letters out and come back to the executives to be edited and then sent back for a final copy. And then something magical happened in 1961. The IBM Selectric typewriter was invented, and they sold one to nearly everybody in the world. I wrote 2 books on an IBM Selectric typewriter, and they were on the secretary's desk of every corporation and pretty much in every university. As this evolved over time and the emergence of the PC that began in around 1989, was the migration of the technology to the end user. I tried to find a typewriter at my university the other day, and I couldn't find one. They don't exist. And there are no more secretaries. They do higher level jobs than typing. And I, like you, compose and type most of my letters and have them proofread by someone who is far better at grammar than I. Technology always migrates to the end user. What started over 100 years ago as a highly technical advice is now an assumption that it's a fundamental tool for us today. You're all familiar with February 14th, 1946, of course. That's when the digital revolutions began. How do I know that? Because when I was at Drexel, I had an office three blocks away from where that revolution began. February 14th, they turned on the ENIAC at the University of Pennsylvania. Now, my computer science friends, I know it was not a digital machine, but it's still the beginning of the digital revolution. I had a friend who was in the room. Isaac Auerbach was in the room when they turned the machine on for the first time. And I said, Isaac, you must be really amazing. There you are at the beginning of a revolution that's changed the world. He said, well, actually not. He said, it's the most boring job I ever had. He said, I was a graduate assistant on the project, and you have to remember, we didn't know if it was going to work. Isaac's entire career spans the whole history of digital computing. And talk about things changing and talk about the migration. IBM in 1950 predicted there were the world market for about 4 computers in the world every year. Boy, were they wrong. But the integration into the corporations and the universities was a similar model of the typewriter. Highly technical advice, mainframe environment. In fact, I always liked, as an undergraduate, I always liked to work in the computer center because it was air conditioned. The only place on campus it was. And what we saw then is the migration from where you sent information into a mainframe with specialists to be able to process. We came to desktops, then laptops, then personal digital devices. Migration to the end user. Some of the people in this room don't know what the word Hollerith is. I'm going to hold one up. This is the Hollerith card. It's an IBM punch card. It represents 1 byte of information. And at the early days of computing, when we were doing research, we would punch holes in these things. Initially it was air, then it became light, it would slide in front of the screen, light would project it through, and it would communicate information into a mainframe system. And those of us who were interested in this, we hand punch thousands of these things. They'd go into the mainframe, it'd come back, there's an error in one of the 2,000 cards. And you have to redo the whole thing. State of the art. We then moved to floppies. 6-inch, 8-inch. And you know what died in the last decade? This died. How many of you have access to a small floppy anymore? Me too, but we don't use it. There's nothing on it I want. To USB drives, to the terabyte breakthrough. This Christmas I bought as a gift a terabyte, which is twice as big physically as my iPhone. What's a terabyte? A terabyte is a trillion bytes. A trillion bytes. I bought it for $95. I've written 9 books. I could put every one of them on there, including all the edits that I went through. I could put every photograph that I've ever taken in my life on that. I could put every letter that I've written, all my email, and I'd still only be a third full. When the price of digital of storage comes down, magical things happen. What's going to happen in this pathway is that we are going to continue to see growth in power that's going to migrate to the end user. Migrate to the end user. That's you. That means you're not going to have to go through any intermediary for these new tools. Apple got it right. It's the I generation. It's about you. And one of the consequences is that things are changing in that there are the disappearance of centers of ideation. What does that mean? Where one of the great leaps in technology that happened in this country in New Jersey was Edison created a center for ideas and patented, I don't know, 200 or 300 new devices which changed the world. You are now the center of ideation. The iPhone and the iMac, they are all open architecture and inviting you to create new applications, which you will. So what you've got to do is you have to understand that you are empowered to adopt, to adapt, to create new tools. And whatever tools are created, you will have direct access. There will be no longer intermediaries. Oh, by the way, don't ever forget my friend Greg Olson's observation. Who's Greg Olson? Greg Olson, besides being a Fairleigh Dickinson University grad, paid $20 million to go up in the Russian rocket to be in the space station. And he had a little money left over. And Greg tells a story. He says, you know, the U.S., when we were planning and going into space, we spent about $5 million to develop a pen that writes in space. The Russians took a pencil. Technical sophistication is not necessarily the issue. What's the issue is new and emerging tools that you will directly control, and we've got to prepare you to understand that and take control. 4, near unlimited digital information access. This is really from a result of the growth in computing and memory capacity. When you have nearly unlimited memory, it's amazing what you can do. But it's my contention that Google's business plan is to own all the information in the world. And they're going to sell it back to us in another 10 years. But I think that's an okay thing. Because what that means is if Google has collected, amassed, and organized all the information in the world, for the first time in the history of our species, you're going to have access to that knowledge base. You're going to have access by the decade of your 30s in the knowledge base of this species, which has never happened before. So when you have this digital storage, because they're scanning, you know, they've contracted with the New York Public Library, with the University of Chicago, with Princeton, with Yale, to scan the contents of their libraries and digitize it so they're searchable. So when you have every piece of information in a digital storage format, then you have access through sophisticated systems and the ability to download. You can then pick the format. And it's challenging the history of the book. And let me tell you, I have the best-selling book in the world on print and publishing. It's in the 5th edition. It's been translated in Chinese, and I love the book. But let me tell you, the book becomes less important because once it's digitized, we can give it to you in book form. We can give it to you in auditory form. You want it in Braille, we can do that. You want it in a scroll, we can do that. Because the format becomes less important than the content, which changes the way you think about learning. Because we can now reconfigure, and we as educators and you as learners don't have to follow that linear path, which is a book from page 1 to 300. And many of us in the room have made nice royalties off of that. But let me tell you, it's changed. Because you can create alternate pathways because you learn differently. And in fact, as the I person, you can control the pathway in which you learn. That's a revolution. So, with unlimited access and format to the knowledge base of our species, you better understand knowledge systems. That should be part of your education. How is knowledge organized? You have to then have the ability to access information when you need it. Knowledge of organizational systems and the ability to enter into that system and find what you want. And then you've got to have the ability to evaluate what you find. Because let me tell you, you can find lies in books and you can find lies on the internet. How do you as an individual, as the I individual, have the ability to judge what are the critical abilities to judge whether something is right or wrong, has foundation or not? You got to know how to use it. You got to know how to apply it. Synthesis skills. This is going to affect all of us in education at every level. Number 5, an ever-accelerating rate of change. Half-life of knowledge right now is estimated to be about 5.4 years. For my colleagues in the room who don't know what that means particularly in technical areas, that means a little over every 5 years, half of the technical or scientific knowledge we know has been made obsolete because it's been replaced by new information, new knowledge. So almost by the time you finished your undergraduate career, what you learned in Chemistry 1 has probably been radically changed. Powerful. And the stuff we're thinking about. Do you know what the goals of the Genome Project? You know about the goals? The goals of the Genome Project is to, one, to identify 20 to 25,000 genes in the human DNA. Then to determine the sequences of the 3 billion chemical base pairs, and then to put this information in a database so everybody can have access to it. Wow, what a set of goals. We finished it in 2003. It's over. It's done. The project's complete and it's available. Did it escape your notice? That's the end of the digital revolution. From Isaac Auerbach, who says, we didn't know if it was going to work, to the decoding of the human genome and allowing that to be accessed by anybody in the world. There was a time in my life when the year 2000 was so far away I didn't know whether I was going to be alive or not. And then it happened. And I blinked and the first decade is gone. And the number of changes, the degree of changes in this last decade in our lives, in our world, is so overwhelming it's hard to grasp. Let me tell you, the end of the digital revolution means we're on to something else, and the next decade are going to be increasingly complex. Information building on information with unlimited knowledge, with new tools, says exponential growth in technical understanding, which is translated into how you live and how you survive and how you work. I was a hero 2 years ago at Christmas. I gave my wife an iPod. And I was really proud. And she was thrilled. And between Christmas and New Year's, we danced the dance of downloading and technical currency, and we were really this happening couple who knew what's on the edge of innovation. Do you know what Apple did January 2nd? They came out with a new version of the iPod. And you want to scream. Wait a minute. Let me figure this out before you change it. Never going to happen. It is going to be nothing more than an ever-accelerating rate of change. This means once you think you've got something figured out, it will change again. That's going to be the nature of the environment in which you live. In an environment of ambiguity and change, agility, adaptability, and analytical skills are critically important. Because you won't survive the rate of change if you don't have those skills. So what is this new skill set? What should we be doing? What should I be doing? What should you be doing to provide a skill set for the freshman class of this year, for the decade of their 30s? The trend lines are pretty clear. It's going to be a more diverse world, permeability of national borders, further migration of technology to end users, near unlimited digital information access, and ever-accelerating rate of change. Are you asking yourself those questions? You know, if we don't pay attention to this, in the best case, education will become irrelevant. In the worst case, it will become destructive because we haven't given the next generation the skill set they need to succeed in this world. I'm going to take a glass of water. Any questions? And I use that as a transition. I have more for you, but you know, it's called comic relief in the Shakespearean era. That you can't take too much tragedy. You have to take a deep breath and relax and slam the comic relief for this moment.